Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start this webinar in just a few minutes. Just to get started, I'm going to share a couple of our upcoming webinars. On Wednesday, September 4th, Dr. Yvonne Yim will be presenting a webinar on the challenges in accessing rural healthcare in Hawaii. On Tuesday, September 10th, Jun Wang will present on using artificial intelligence to enhance occupational exposure assessment and control. That's going to be with our industrial hygiene webinar series. And lastly, on September 18th, we're going to have a webinar with Dr. Devana Piljuk on engaging frontline workers to solve ergonomics problems. And you can always find out more about other webinars at www.coeh.berkeley.edu/webinars. So just want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on behalf of education and research centers throughout the country. We are pleased to present the Ergonomics webinar series. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar, Technology, Health, and Safety in the Hospitality Industry, is presented by Dr. Cynthia Mejia and Mindy Shoss in partnership with the Sunshine Education and Research Center at the University of South Florida. A few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page within 5 business days. All participants who logged in today with their registration email for the full live presentation will receive an email tomorrow with a link to an evaluation form. And with that evaluation form, you'll also be able to get a certificate worth 1 continuing education contact hour. So now I'm going to introduce our presenters, Cynthia Mejia and Mindy Shoss. Dr. Cynthia Mejia is the Dean of the University of Central Florida Rosen College and a professor in the Department of Food Service and Lodging Management. Dr. Mindy Shoss is a professor of industrial and organizational psychology in the Department of Psychology at University of Central Florida. Both of them direct a NIOSH-sponsored targeted research training program, which is part of the Sunshine Education and Research Center, which we'll hear a little bit more about today. Situated in the most visited destination in the United States, the TRT program aims to train the next generation of workplace professionals to identify and address threats to health, safety, and well-being in the hospitality and tourism industries. This program focuses on the underserved population of hospitality and tourism workers who have a wide and unusual range of risks on their jobs. Really excited to have you both here today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will pass it over to you both. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Hoping that you can see my screen. Great. Okay. Greetings from Orlando, Florida, everyone. Greetings from UCF, and we're so happy to be here. My name is Cynthia Mejia, and my colleague is Mindy Shoss. We are going to present to you our work on technology, health, and safety in the hospitality industry. And before we begin the presentation, Mindy is going to explain a little bit about our relationship with the Sunshine ERC.
Thank you. So as Cynthia mentioned, we're part of the Sunshine Education Research Center, which is a collaboration among UCF, University of Central Florida in Orlando, USF, University of South Florida in Tampa, and Riverdale Aeronautical University and University of Puerto Rico. And as a center, the center-wide mission is to transform workplace quality of life through transdisciplinary education, research and practice, and industry partnerships. The program we run here at UCF is called the Targeted Research Training Program. So this program is aimed primarily at training students and occupational health professionals and industry professionals to improve health, safety, and well-being in the hospitality industry. And we have 3 pillars of our program. First is cutting edge research. So we'll talk today on the research stream that we've embarked on, trying to address technology and how technology is intersected with a variety of occupational safety, health, and well-being issues, particularly for frontline vulnerable workers in this industry. We also focus very much on impact. So we have an advisory board that we work closely with members from industry, labor, academia, and government. We hold regular research to practice outreach events with members of both the academic and the local industry communities. And our aim is to put research in the hands of people who are best positioned to use it. And finally, a third pillar, which is really holds up the rest of this, is training. And so, as I mentioned, we are charged with training the next generation of occupational health and safety professionals and empowering students and helping students develop skills to go out and make positive impacts in the industry through promoting evidence-based practice. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Cynthia, and you can share about our research.
Fantastic. All right. So we have a few learning objectives throughout our presentation. The first one is to share with you some of the contextual nuances of the hospitality and the services industries as it pertains to technology adoption readiness among line level workers or frontline workers. And then also we seek to evaluate the advantages and barriers of adopting these technological solutions for the occupational health and safety of frontline workers. And then through our research and some of the things in our findings that we will share some best practices to inform how some of these emergent technologies will improve or can improve when best utilized that will help the frontline workers. So for those of you who may not know a lot about this sector, the hospitality and tourism industry, it has quite a significant impact, certainly the United States and where we're at here in Orlando, Florida. But just to share a few numbers, the whole sector was equated to $1.3 trillion in direct spending in 2023 in the United States, but with an overall $2.8 trillion economic footprint. And this was about 2.5% of our national GDP, a representation of that. And in 2023, the industry supported nearly 15 million American workers, of which 8 million were directly employed within the sector. So there's many bubble out effects about how this industry impacts many types of workers. Also, another interesting fact, 2022, we captured this number, is about $160+ billion in total tax revenues that go on to help other sectors and our population. And in the state of Florida alone, we had about $89 billion in state and local tax revenues coming off of this industry. So a significant economic impact for sure. And really what's got us thinking about technology adoption was, our work, even more so in, during the COVID era, because all the services industries were hit hard, especially hospitality and tourism. And those of you who look at the labor statistics and look at these charts often, we can see that, in 2020, in February 2020, it was 14.4 million workers in our industry, and just slowly moving up and building out the significance of our industry. And then just a drop, a massive drop in 2020, which equated to what was called the Great Resignation, furloughs, layoffs, so many people leaving the industry. And then, as we see from this graph and also these numbers, just the slow, gradual increase coming back to some normality. And we haven't quite hit those pre-numbers yet, because we had something that was called the Great Reshuffling. So folks left the industry first, and they went on to look for other work. And then the Great Reshuffling was in this industry was people in the services, people who had services jobs. They went and looked for other, retail or other service-related jobs in which to work. And this is when the use of robots started to become more readily adopted. And prior to the pandemic, the hospitality and tourism industry in the United States was there was a little bit of reluctance to the adoption of robots, but it was through the desire for heightened awareness of hygiene and safety, not to be served by humans at the height of the pandemic, and businesses coming back. There was more demand in another side of technology for contactless payment, mobile ordering, digital keys and such. So again, not a lot of human interaction during that time. And because there were fewer workers and businesses were starting to open up again, not enough workers coming back to meet the demand, that's when the industry started thinking about and investing more in service robots to close that gap. But also, people were sitting at home, and this is on the consumer side, and surely employees were involved to some extent, but on the consumer side, people still wanted those travel experiences. So we saw an increase in virtual tours and experiences, AI. And on the workforce side, as robotics and other technological tools started advancing, we saw an increased use of AI, certainly now more so, but in the height of the pandemic, we began to see the greater use. And so now we're in this sort of, time when assuredly AI is a big point of discussion, but also how are we going to bring technologies on? And there's concern, rightful concern around people feeling like, well, maybe they'll be replaced by technology, displacement. That's certainly a concern. There are, worries about the consumer experience, because our industry, the service industry, is all about engagement with humans and delivering on a service promise and exceeding expectations, and bringing on technology, and especially in the form of robots, bringing those types of things back in. That, in an industry where workers were used to and were tipped and made money and were paid to deliver exceptional experiences, when robots are introduced into that environment, or touchless payment or kiosks or anything that separates a worker from a customer, that introduces a lot of anxieties. And so through our research, which we'll share some findings in a moment, but through our research, those things are top of mind for workers mostly, because they want to participate and give good service. We partnered with Bear Robotics because they were also interested in this, and they wanted to understand also how service robots could be better used or rightfully used. They wanted to understand how workers were accepting of their robots. And so they were very generous with their time and their access. And so the TRT, our Targeted Research Training Program, has partnered with Bear Robotics for about little over 3 years now. And we've conducted a series of studies where we have visited different restaurants and senior living facilities where these robots have been adopted. We've conducted with our graduate students many hours of observation to just watch what was going on. We've done interviews, and we'll share that in a moment, our findings with workers who have used these robots, service robots. And then we also recently did a quantitative study of consumer perception of employees who are using service robots. And this is a recent study we can share with you in the Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Technology. This was a qualitative study with colleagues Hannah Crandall, Emily Broker, and of course, Dr. Mindy Shoss. And we interviewed a little over 40 workers, servers, expediters, people who work in bartending, people who greet and seat, and anybody who has contact with a robot who is a worker in small restaurants where we visited, and also in some senior living facilities. And here's a bit about sharing what we found. And there's a number of themes here that emerge from the interview data. There's 6 in this slide, and that is the notion first of service robot collaboration, and that had to do with the reliability of working with the robot. It had to do with how the workers felt that they could easily interact with it, solve problems. If they felt that they could participate in you know, doing more best practices or solving problems with the robot. So that was the extent, and that was a pretty strong theme here, where they enjoyed talking about that collaboration. And then another theme was service robot optimization, which is, as problems and challenges come along, because the traditional service dyad, which is a worker and a consumer, changes when you introduce technology. So as that technology comes on, a server in a restaurant, for example, has to decide, does the customer want to be entertained by this robot and the technology, or does the customer prefer human attention in the service delivery? So there's a lot of stress placed on a worker to determine in that moment how to deliver the best service. And so when that's going on with multiple tables in an evening, in a week, in a month, and in a year, servers and people who work with service robots have ideas that they want to implement. They have ideas for process improvement and the use of the technology on the job. And so they voiced that, caring about that. Number 3 was service robot integration, which had to do with managerial support and organizational support and training, and to what extent their management would help them with productivity and actually listen to the recommendations. Number 4, the 4th theme, was service robot engagement, and that is where servers and others who use the service robots we're leveraging the happiness and the novelty of a robot going to a table or going to a customer, and they were able to figure out how to impact service quality with bringing on the robot, and they did have some feelings of enjoyment in being successful in delivering a high quality of service. Number 5 was service robot workforce effects, and that had to do with some people that we spoke with, some of the participants that we spoke with, especially those who had been, for example, one server had worked for 30 years as a restaurant server, had a lot of experience, and felt that their passion to do that work was not recognized, that people would rather see a robot at the table or be served by a robot. Small children were very delighted. And so it had some effects on their well-being. For example, this same worker said sometimes that they feel they're competing with the robot for attention, or that they have to run to the table first before the robot gets there. So there is some stress on workers in this particular study. And then sort of even a little bit further down the line on that continuum was something we found called service robot resentment, which were actually feelings of dread and anger and frustration in having to work with the robot. And that's in places where there is mandated use. So if there's not a robot in an organization, a service organization, and one day an employee comes and is told they have to use it, that creates some feelings and some anger, potentially frustration. Not everyone is excited to use it. They want to be trained, they want to understand, and they should actually be, our recommendation is that they should be brought in early in the process and buy into actually using a service robot. This small study was published in the Harvard Business Review, and this was based on our observations of servers and workers in different service environments who are working with robots, and speaking with them and trying to understand and offer up industry some places where they could begin to think about how to adopt a service robot. So sort of what I had mentioned before, we found that one of the probably the biggest best practices is to get buy-in from employees about, should we have this robot? Should we introduce technology? What problem are we trying to solve? And then really gaining their buy-in, because if they are resentful, if the robot is mandated and they are resentful, that translates into not only destruction to their well-being, but it also ultimately hurts the business and the customer. And so getting their buy-in early and often prior to the adoption is really critical. Another thing we found in our observations and in our work is that there's a physical space mapping that occurs when a service robot is brought in, and maybe you've seen these in banks, or I've seen them in hardware stores, and certainly in restaurants, in hospitals. The physical space has to be considered, because robots need to go over thresholds, say from carpeting to different types of flooring. There are walls or furniture that could impede the movement. And so if workers are used to working, say in a restaurant setting, if they're used to working in a section of 5 tables, if there's planters, or if there's pretty walls or drapery or something around that section, then the robot can't fully get into that section for whatever reason, whether it's the thresholds or the actual space. And so not only would the organization be mandating the use of the robot, but now there are stressors on how that robot can get into the space. So organizations, before they adopt, they really need to think about the physical space and if things need to be changed and moved, and that actually incurs costs. And then the third thing that we learned was on consistent and ongoing training and support is really important for employees because again, changing the service from a dyad to a triad takes its toll, especially on people who've done this type of service work for a very, very long time. And so they need support, they need to be heard, they need to be encouraged to share the ideas to improve their work environment and the use of the service robot. Right, so that was the one type of study, and our work is ongoing in that area. But here's another type of technology that we've worked with and have thought about in the hospitality industry, and this came out of wearables. It's the wearable watches. This came out of during COVID, when there were fewer and fewer people in hotels, and housekeepers, hotel housekeepers, had to go to work, and they were either alone or there were not many people on the floor in the hotel. So we were thinking about their physical safety. And then also we were thinking about pulse ox and other indicators, if they were to become sick. So we entertained this idea of, what could a smartwatch do? How could it be helpful? And, over time, we refined our research questions and what we are trying to understand. And ultimately, when we were able to find a partner, because it's difficult, all of you who are researchers know that the idea can be amazing, but finding an industry partner who'd be willing to open their doors and allow us to do this work has to be mutually beneficial. So what we ultimately landed on was, is measuring heart rate and step counts against self-reported stress through the trajectory of a workday, and how a wearable could help with this. So what we did is we got 20 volunteers, 20 housekeepers, and we outfitted them each with a Garmin watch. And they came to work every day. They wore the watches every work day for 30 days. And we did pre and post test surveys. We did focus groups with them. We asked them to report daily stress. And we organized with other researchers on the team to collect their heart rates and their step counts. And this was modeled with these two graphs you see below here, where the red indicates high heart rate, high steps. So on the left here, you can see that a hotel housekeeper would come in, start their day. They'd be very, very busy. And, they would be cleaning rooms, they'd be turning over the rooms. And then towards the end of the day, it sort of attenuates and the work slows down. So that's one example on the left. On the right, we can see that a worker has a different situation. In the beginning of the day, they didn't have a lot of work for whatever reason. Maybe it's a Sunday morning and hotel guests want to sleep in a little bit, so they can't get in the rooms right away. And then towards the end of the day, you start to see probably a high number of checkouts, hotel checkouts. And then of course that work increases at the end of the day. Well, interestingly, what we were seeing was that in the left scenario, the hotel housekeepers were self-reporting low stress. They were leaving work feeling really good. They had a good day and lower amounts of stress. Where in the right side, the right image, where they had a lot of cleaning at the end of the day, they were reporting high levels of stress. And so, this might seem, common sense that we could think that, but this was a first study to actually capture this phenomenon. And this is helpful because we can then go to the organization and say, well, on these specific days, or if there's a pattern of these types of days, the technology and the data that we're collecting maybe suggests that bringing in a third shift or modifying the work hours so that this person in the second scenario wouldn't have such a heavy workload at the end of their shift, so that they too could go home feeling good and less stress. So those are two examples that we have in our work and recent work. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Shoss to talk about our book chapter.
Thank you. So, what we're seeing across the different technologies that we're researching and the different studies that we've done and conversations we've had with workers and folks in industry is that there are a set of issues that are tied to a specific technology itself, as well as a set of issues that seem to emerge that are really tied to the organizational environment in which the technologies are then being implemented. And so, what you see on this slide are findings from a symposium and workshop that we held for International Housekeeping Week back in fall 2022. And the focus was on the future of housekeeping. So, these findings will be published in a forthcoming book chapter led by Hannah Crandall, who is a senior TRT student working with us. But our symposium was really led by students of our whole program. And we had participants from academia, from industry, from labor, as well as from NIOSH. And so a big part of that symposium and workshop was to have some discussions about the role that technology is playing coming out of the pandemic, but also expectations, optimism, as well as concern about how technology would play into the future of housekeeping. And so, from a very zoomed out view, you can see the word cloud based on the results, and you see worker well being, technology, change, productivity. All these things were pretty prominent topics of the discussion. And I think underlying some of that is this kind of dual tension that we see, or at least two dual tensions that we see. One between technology to serve customer and consumer needs, as well, and then how technology is or is not serving the well-being of the employee. And so there's also a tension between, as the chapter's titled, the promise of technology to help enhance well-being, as you've seen with some of the findings from the wearable studies and the robot studies, as well as concerns about potential decrements to well-being that might come from the technology itself or the way that it's introduced in the environment. And so if you look at the top right-hand corner in that figure, when we drill down on the specific topics and patterns that people spoke about, again, you see questions about technology. How does it fit with the task? What's the capabilities of the technology? And then you also see, again, organizational concerns about processes and systems to basically support technology having its intended effects. So we see concerns about technology readiness, language as a potential barrier, questions about training and how to address skill gaps, and then generally, as Dr. Mejia talked about, just organizational support, because bringing in new technologies creates an adjustment process, and that's a high stakes adjustment process for many frontline workers and services who rely heavily on tips and relationships with consumers and customers for their pay. So, building from this, one of the goals of our research and our program and our ongoing work is to try to take the body of research evidence, try to build the research evidence, but also to try to articulate and provide some guidance around what a human-centered approach to developing and deploying technology might be, both in general, because I think there are some lessons that we've learned that are generalizable across industries, but also particularly to the hospitality industry, where you do have variety of different worker populations, as well as many workers that would be considered to be in more vulnerable positions. So echoing Dr. Mejia's point earlier, much of the impact of technology in a way is determined by the roles or the functions that technology is intended to serve. So I think in discussions about technology, we somewhat do a disservice if we talk about just technology in a vacuum without considering, okay, how is that technology being brought in? What is it supposed to be doing? Is it supposed to complement work? Is it supposed to replace some work? More specifically, when we talk about AI, is this going to supervise tasks or direct work? Is it going to be expected to generate new tasks? Or are we talking about technologies that are either being marketed as or being brought in to replace people? And if you think about these different technologies, wearables, robots, even AI technologies, from the perspective of starting with the functions that it's going to serve, it raises a whole set of really organizational issues that we think need to be considered. So if you consider technology that's being brought in to complement or replace tasks, again, thinking about, okay, which tasks are being complemented and replaced? Are these tasks that are generally enjoyable to workers? Or are you replacing tasks that perhaps are dangerous or less enjoyable to workers? There's quite a big difference when you think about job quality and the worker well-being and experience, depending on what task you're actually replacing. Again, the functionality of the technology becomes important. So if we talk about the cobot paradigm or partnerships between a server, a robot, and a consumer, then it's important to note exactly how well the technology fits that purpose and performs that task and how reliably it does so. Again, a big issue is training. And there's a whole set of questions around training and making sure there's access to training for employees with different skill sets, and recognizing that there are digital divides, or there are lots of different kind of foundational experiences that people have that vary quite a bit when we think about technology. Another important point is autonomy. Do workers have a choice whether or not to use this technology? And of course, that's going to vary in sort of the life cycle of deploying a technology. There are some technologies, for example, in our housekeeping symposium, some hotels discussed online clean room tracking softwares that housekeepers have to use to communicate with the front desk. So there, as these technologies get adopted, there may be less choice in whether or not they're used. And so hopefully there's been input from the worker as to whether or not this is a viable way of moving forward. Again, if you think about this from an organizational standpoint, thinking about the impact on people's roles or status, workload, work hours available to them, pay. Sometimes these things are considered after the fact, but certainly we found that the organizations that really think through the implications before adopting technology have a much smoother process, as well as career progression. So you see similar sets of questions come up when we think about technology providing a supervisory function. Where this tends to get discussed is in terms of AI or the gig economy, or basically technology mediated work assignments or work evaluations. And again, there's a whole set of questions around here in terms of thinking about what tasks are supervised. Does the technology do a good job assigning tasks or supervising a task, but also needing to think about psychological issues in terms of autonomy or ethics, fairness, transparency, accountability. And again, thinking particularly in the hospitality tourism industry, a lot of these jobs are entry points into the economy. And so needing to think about not only what's the impact on that one job, but what's the impact on this person's entire career and the workload or the status and the hours and pay and all these things that are really important for both individuals and society more broadly. One thing we found is technology often generates new tasks. So even for bringing in a service robot, then someone needs to be responsible for kind of managing or programming it or dealing with issues that arise or remembering to charge it, things like that. And so again, that creates a set of tasks that people may be able to fill and may generate kind of new jobs. But again, it's worthwhile to think through what the implications of those are for skill level and quality, quantity, as well as access to work. And finally, I think the topic that seems to get the most discussion, certainly in the popular press, is technology replacing people, which is certainly a very scary prospect, understandably so. And a lot of technologies are being marketed, I think, for replacing people. Now, one needs to, again, think through what this really means. Is it augmenting capabilities? Is it helping with worker flexibility? So, if staff call out, we have more hands on deck. That's a very different circumstance than just bringing technology in for the sole purpose of replacing people. And then one thing you need to think about is, of course, technology can break, and someone may probably need to be there to fix the broken technology. So I think the story from Japan in the Hanana Hotel, where they tried to create a fully autonomous robot staff for the hotel and ultimately had to fire all the robots because they created more work for the human employees. So I think, although again there is certainly reason to be nervous about that outcome, I think hopefully we'll see more technology working in partnership with people, brought in with a lot of these organizational considerations in mind. So I just wanted to close on this figure that actually Hannah, our student, put together that incorporates a lot of the main themes that we've been seeing from talking with industries and industry professionals and researchers about the technology, and mapping those onto the U.S. Surgeon General's recent priorities for workplace well-being, as well as the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy AI Bill of Rights. Just quite briefly, the U.S. Surgeon General's priority for workplace well-being emphasizes protection from physical and psychological harm, connection, community, work-life harmony, mattering at work, and opportunity for growth as the building blocks or the essential conditions that are needed for workplace well-being. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, AI Bill of Rights, talks about human protection in this rapidly expanding AI environment. And although their discussion is certainly around AI, we think that the principles can apply more broadly in terms of thinking about safe and effective technological systems and protection against discrimination, data privacy, notice explanation, certainly appropriate training. And so the point that I think we've been working to in our research is that addressing worker decision-making and training and autonomy through providing opportunities for worker voice and addressing concerns about ethics and privacy and mitigating skill disparities, that not only can ensure ethical integration of technology in the workplace, but we can actually think about this as a framework to bring technologies in that can positively contribute to mental health and well-being, which I think is an outcome that all of us are striving to work towards. So with that, I will end our presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Here's a list of references to the TRT team's work on this topic. In the top right-hand corner of the presentation is also a QR code to our website. And so we encourage you to communicate with us and check our website as we continue to work in this area.
Thank you so much. This has been a really interesting presentation. And I think one thing, I can start off the Q&A a bit. I thought it was fascinating how you start off talking about the influence of the pandemic and how it's a really interesting moment for customer service right now, and that we have lots of technology that can be adopted. And we're also in this moment post-pandemic of kind of figuring out what customer service looks like, especially in hospitality. One thing I was wondering about here in the Bay Area and in other places, I've noticed that certain restaurants and other businesses have moved to very much focusing on delivery. Sometimes they don't even have tables. Sometimes there's like not even the physical space where you would have, customers interacting with employees in that way. And I'm curious if in your research or just in thinking through some of these issues, you've thought about this new aspect of delivery being so important to hospitality and maybe how technology can be integrated into that aspect of the business.
Yes, I can answer that question. I'm going to put it back on the previous slide because I think some of these things can kind of, should I leave it up there? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's great.
So, so it's driven by demand. Customers, during the pandemic, when especially food service and hotel organizations, they invested a lot and went to contactless ordering, payment, key card, and customers really like that. I mean, I personally have enjoyed that, instead of having to take so much time to park and sit down and do all of that, to have every type of level of dining, whether it's quick service or even fine dining models at some point. I mean, packaging has gone to be more beautiful to sell that product, and it is driven by consumers and what they want. But to what you're saying is that, coming out, going into the pandemic and then during, with all of these furloughed workers and people switching to other services industries and not really fully coming back, there's just a kind of a convergence right now. So there's fewer people who want to work in that way. And then there's the consumers who want to get their food and beverage in that same way. But I think what's promising about all of this is that people who do remain in the industry, especially on the service side, or what we call the front of house side of the industry, there's really creative people when given the agency, when given the support by the organization, they can create a whole new paradigm of service. So I'll use a quick example. There's a hotel here in Orlando, and this is what first caught our eye about this research. There's a hotel here in Orlando that dressed a robot up in a Starbucks outfit. The employees did this. It wasn't the management that did this. The employees said, let's put the Starbucks outfit on the robot. They put little Starbucks drinks inside the top of the robot, and they programmed the robot to tell dad jokes in the lobby of the hotel. So the robot would go around telling the dad jokes, and consumers were, grab a coffee or whatever it was inside. And so that kind of co-creation, that kind of creativity that actually uses, in this case, the service robot, it uses the technology as a tool to change the dynamic. I mean, this, I believe, is the future. It's where we're going. If organizations are to retain some form of human contact in their service delivery. You know, we see it as a pendulum. Some went way to just having the robots deliver it. Some, by some means, are keeping only humans to do all this work. But I think there will be a place in the middle that we rest on in the coming years.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I would hope that we reach that middle too. I have a question from a guest, Claudia. It's a great question. She asked, could you please give an example of how technology can be used in housekeeping to mitigate disparity, given that over 90% are Hispanic females with diverse education background, usually low, and uncertain immigration status? I think this is a great question just to bring it back to the people aspect of kind of integrating some of these technologies. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Want to try that, Mindy, or you want?
Oh, go for it.
Okay, I'll start off and maybe you can come on. So part of this is teaching people how to manage robots, cleaning robots, all types of technologies. And it's an upskilling that's occurring. This is a really good opportunity for that. I don't know if that directly answers the question, but when we worked with the housekeepers, we had Hispanic housekeepers. We also had Haitian housekeepers from where we're at in the country, where the workforce comes, and there's two things that have to happen. One thing that we learned is there's a trust factor with the types of technology. In the case of the robots, we had to take a lot of time explaining that they're not being traced or tracked, or the data wasn't being used for nefarious purposes, or that the organization wasn't going to use their data in any way. So there's a lot of education on that side of it. But it was interesting because we asked them a question about how does the wearable look, and we outfitted some people with sort of utilitarian kind of ugly watches, and we outfitted some with really pretty watches, pink or white, and they were lovely, and they they felt appreciated by small touches that don't cost that much on the use of the technology. So it's sort of several things. It's explaining, it's listening, it's answering questions, it's assuring them about data use. It's also, if organizations are going to use these types of things, then consider them to be good looking and light and comfortable. And then and that's on the wearables case, but on the robot case, it's also opportunities for training and upskilling. So I don't know if you have more to add, Mindy, on that.
Sure. So one additional example that I thought I would add actually came from the discussions in our future of housekeeping symposium, and some participants were talking about, so much of work is sort of technologic sized. I don't know, but it's probably not the right word, but so much of the work, think about paychecks, think about scheduling, all of that's coming through online cloud-based type systems. And they were talking about, in their organization, that's really a challenge because of language or literacy. And they're talking about using technology to provide sort of visual aids or real-time trainings or videos that people could listen to help them understand some of these more complicated technologies, like being able to find a paycheck or finding answers to these questions. So Even certainly when you think about the emerging technologies, but even technologies that I think some of us are used to, particularly those of us who do computer-based work, but that's now getting spread out through a whole bunch of different jobs, then there are perhaps even more technology that may actually help increase access and make it more understandable, or answer questions kind of in real time, when other support's not available.
Thank you. Yeah, the education side seems important, both as like educating people about the actual technology and then using technology also just for further education. We have a question from another guest, Ernesto. He says, I have observed in the agriculture industry, physically demanding jobs replaced with autonomous equipment. Workers often report isolation and boredom. Could similar effects be seen in hospitality?
So I would imagine so. Say, for example, back of the house, which is culinary kitchen, if someone's, watching, Flippy making the hamburgers, or there's even this robotic technology that is a wok, and it does fried rice and different meals, and the person puts in their ingredients and such. So yeah, that could totally, I could see how that would be boring. But also it was interesting in our findings on the front of the house that people that we spoke with actually liked that they didn't have to carry heavy trays, and that their backs didn't hurt at the end of the day, their wrists didn't hurt. There were fewer slips and falls. And typically in this industry, in front of the house and also in the back of the house, see a lot of workers working two shifts. That's not an uncommon thing in our industry. The first shift is the breakfast and lunch, and the second shift is the dinner. And a lot of people in our industry have, line level especially, have two jobs. And so, when we ask them, to explain, well, do you go home feeling better? Yeah, I go home feeling better. And also I feel better in my second job. And, while that's not anything that we want to hear as a long-term solution, because, we want to see better wages and fair pay, just the fact that especially for older workers in the front of the house, that they don't have pain, that they go home feeling good, or even to their next job or wherever it is, that actually, that type of automation helps people, which is a good goal.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it back to the ergonomic side of it, which is that some of these really physically difficult tasks, it is actually nice to give workers a break, have something that's less physically demanding. I think that's a really promising aspect of all this technology. Um, I had a question about a trend that I think has also increased since the pandemic, and that we've actually done different webinars on, which is workplace violence, and how frontline workers and workers in grocery stores and restaurants and whatnot, there's an increase in sort of interpersonal conflict often between employees and customers. And I'm wondering if that has come up in your research, or how you would think about technology interfering or somehow getting involved in these altercations, because I could imagine people also don't necessarily want to talk to a robot when they're angry. But we also have to think about employees' well-being, keeping them safe. So I'm curious if that's come up in your research.
That actually came up in the wearables study, because as I mentioned, that when we first thought about it, we were our worry and our kind of concern was around hotel housekeepers with not a lot of people around, and we were worried about their safety. And we had thought about panic buttons inside the room, but that's difficult. Sometimes those work, sometimes they don't. We thought about, you know, panic buttons that sometimes they leave on their carts. And that's why we thought, well, couldn't they wear it? Couldn't we have a wearable or a watch that, you know, whatever they pressed or however, you know, whatever they did to it, that would set up a silent help that they could be located. They would, you know, it'd be easy to find them, and they could be helped. And that's actually how this sort of started on the wearables side. And then when COVID came, we started thinking about you know, pulse ox and other things. So that I think that from our research, the housekeepers liked wearing them, especially when they were pretty looking. They wanted to wear them, and I think that there's promise there for safety. As for the robot side, we we mostly saw consumers who were very delighted by the novelty of it, or if they frequented the restaurant, that that it didn't matter anymore. They just saw it as part of this experience. The part that's interesting where it's not violence, but it was maybe agitation, is when a worker was upset with it. So we did see instances of, if it wasn't quite moving the way it's supposed to or wasn't close enough, we saw, you know, angry workers kind of jerking it over or kicking it with their foot. We saw some of that. And that was more of a function on the facility and the space involved in it. I mean, I'd say lastly, and you'd have to be really careful about the use of this technology, is the ability for it to record and see things that are going on, which may not be a bad idea, especially in late at night when there's fewer people on property, to have the ability. We do that with security cameras anyway, but maybe there's smaller robots that that can kind of help in say if you have a very large facility, that might be helpful. But we haven't seen, we didn't in our research see instances of aggression from consumers.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to think about just how we think about, or how these perspectives come out in these interactions, but how we think about technology and its implementation and everything. And that's useful to think about how wearables can also keep some of the housekeepers safe, other workers safe. We are at time, so I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Mindy and Cynthia, for presenting with us. And we look forward to having you at our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Bye.